My name is Eliza May Penhaligon, and I was born in the spring of 1832 in a small timber cottage nestled in the rugged hills of Cornwall, England. I am now 94 years old, and as I sit here by the fire, watching the world move at a pace that would have terrified my mother, I find myself thinking of a time that seems more like a dream than a memory. It was a world of absolute silence and heavy labor, where the only sounds were the wind across the moors and the rhythmic thud of the butter churn. We lived by the sun and the seasons, and our lives were governed by a simple, harsh reality that modern folk can barely comprehend. We lived in a world without doctors. To be born in 1832 was to be born into a gamble where the stakes were life itself. My mother had 10 children, and only 5 of us lived to see our 10th birthdays. We did not speak of medicine or hospitals because such things did not exist for people of our station. If you fell ill, you prayed, and if prayer was not enough, you looked to the hedgerows. My earliest memories are not of toys or games, but of the smell of drying herbs hanging from the kitchen rafters. I remember the sharp scent of yarrow, the bitterness of wormwood, and the earthy musk of comfrey. These were our only shields against the shadows that waited in every draughty corner and every cup of well water. My father was a stone mason, a man whose hands were as hard as the granite he carved. He was a silent man shaped by the weight of the earth and the constant presence of grief. He had buried 5 of his own flesh and blood in the churchyard on the hill, and I remember seeing him stand over those small mounds of dirt with a face that looked as though it had been hewn from the same stone. He worked for a living. He did not cry, because in those days crying was a luxury we could not afford. We simply kept moving, because the hunger was always closer than the sorrow. My mother was the heart of our world, and she was a woman of iron and vinegar. She was the one who knew which root would break a fever, and which leaf would draw the poison from a wound. She carried the weight of the household on her back, rising long before the sun to start the fire, and baking the heavy, crusty bread that fueled my father's labor. I remember watching her hands as she worked. They were red and cracked from the lye soap and the cold water, but they were the only source of comfort I knew. When my brother Silas came down with the croup in the winter of 1838, I watched her sit by his bed for 3 nights without closing her eyes. She kept a pot of tallow and onions simmering on the hearth, and the smell of it still haunts me to this day. There was no one to call, no door to knock on for help. It was just my mother, her prayers, and the desperate hope that the boy's lungs would not fail him before the dawn. We were poor, but we did not know it because everyone we knew lived exactly as we did. We were homespun, wool that scratched our skin, and we ate what the ground gave us. Our lives were measured by the harvest and the slaughter and the long dark months of winter, when the world outside felt like a living enemy. There was a dignity in that struggle, a sense that we were part of something older than the stones themselves. But there was also a terror that never truly left us. A simple scratch from a rusty nail or a sudden chill after a day in the rain could be a death sentence. We lived on the edge of a precipice, and we knew it. I remember the day I realized that the world was a dangerous place. I was 6 years old, and I had followed my sister Mary to the stream to wash the linens. It was a beautiful day, the kind where the gorse smells like honey, and the sky is so blue it hurts to look at. Mary was 12 then, and she was the light of our house. She was singing a song about a sailor when she slipped on a mossy rock and cut her leg. It was not a deep cut, just a jagged tear across her calf. We washed it in the cold stream water, and Mother bound it with clean linen and a poultice of bread and milk. We thought nothing of it, but 3 days later the red streaks began to climb her leg, and the fever took hold of her like a physical hand. I watched my mother try everything she knew. She used the strongest herbs in her chest. She applied heat and then cold, and she stayed on her knees until her petticoats were worn through. But the infection was a fire that could not be put out. There was no medicine to stop the blood from turning sour, and no surgeon to save her. We watched her slip away over the course of a week, and the silence that followed her death was the loudest thing I have ever heard. That was the moment I understood that we were truly alone in our struggle against the elements. We were a family of stone and spirit, but we were made of flesh, and flesh was fragile. Now, as I look at the young people today complaining about the wait at a clinic or the taste of a pill, I want to reach out and tell them about the smell of that sick room. I want them to understand what it means to hold a dying child in your arms and know that there is not a single person in the world who can help you. We did not have doctors, but we had a strength that has been lost in this new age of comfort. We had each other, and we had a fierce, unyielding will to survive. This is the story of how we lived and how we died, and how we found beauty in a world that offered us nothing but hard work and the constant threat of the grave. By the time I reached my 15th year in 1847, the world had begun to expand beyond the borders of our rocky farm, yet the shadow of our medicine-less existence only grew longer. I was no longer a child playing with stones. I was a woman of the house, my hands stained with the juices of the earth, as I helped my mother tend to the village's unofficial needs. You see, when there are no doctors, the community turns to those who have survived the most. My mother, having buried so many, was seen as a woman of great, albeit tragic, wisdom. I remember the long walks we took across the moors, the wind whipping my skirts against my legs as we searched for specific roots. "Eliza," she would say, her voice barely a whisper against the gale, "never take the first plant you see. Leave it for the earth. Take the second, and thank the ground for its mercy." We were not scientists. We were scavengers of hope. We gathered foxglove for the heart and willow bark for the aches of the old men who spent their lives bent double in the tin mines. We knew the risks. We knew that the same plant that could steady a racing heart could also stop it forever if the measure was wrong. There was no manual, no calibrated scale, only the weight of a handful and the intuition born of necessity. It was during these years that I met Thomas. He was a year older than I, a lad with hair the color of sun-bleached hay, and eyes that seemed to hold the very blue of the Atlantic. He worked the coastal trade, hauling salt and coal. Our courtship was not one of grand gestures or written letters, for paper was dear and ink was a luxury, but of shared moments by the stone stiles and quiet glances during Sunday service. In a world where life was so fleeting, love felt like a desperate anchor. We spoke of a future with a certainty that only the young can possess, ignoring the fact that our neighbors were dying of simple fevers and the wasting sickness that seemed to haunt the damp air of our valley. I remember one evening, sitting on a flat granite slab overlooking the sea. Thomas took my hand. His skin was rough, calloused by hemp ropes and salt spray. He told me he wanted to build a cottage of his own, one with a slate roof that wouldn't leak when the winter gales came screaming in from the north. "We'll have a garden, Eliza," he promised, "not just for the pot, but for flowers, roses, like the ones in the stories." I laughed, but my heart ached with a strange foreboding. In 1848, a garden for beauty felt like a defiance of God's will. We were meant to toil, not to admire. The reality of our world broke through our dreams soon enough. A sickness began to move through the coastal villages, what the old folks called the black throat. Today, I believe they call it diphtheria, but to us, it was simply a monster that stole the breath from the young. It started with a sneeze, a slight hoarseness, and then the gray membrane would grow, choking the life out of the strongest men. I watched my mother pace our kitchen, her face a mask of helpless fury. She brewed teas of sage and honey. She made gargles of vinegar and salt. But we were fighting a ghost with a stick. Thomas fell ill in the late autumn. I remember the day the news reached me. I ran 3 miles to his family's hut, my breath coming in ragged gasps that tore at my chest. When I entered, the smell hit me, the cloying, sweet scent of decay, and the heavy, humid air of a room sealed tight against the night miasma. Thomas was unrecognizable. The boy who had promised me roses was struggling for every gulp of air, his neck swollen, his eyes wide with a terror I still see when I close mine at night. His mother was frantic, pressing hot flannels to his throat, her lips moving in a constant, silent prayer. I stayed by his side for 4 days. I did not sleep. I held his hand, the same hand that had promised me a slate roof, and watched the life drain out of it. There was a moment on the 3rd night when the moon was high and the world was deathly still, when he looked at me with a sudden, piercing clarity. He tried to speak, but the words were lost in a wet, rattling wheeze. He squeezed my hand once, a final tether to the world of the living, and then the light behind his eyes simply went out. He was 18. In a world with a doctor, perhaps a simple silver tube or a medicine could have cleared his path to life. But in our world, he was just another name to be carved into a wooden marker. We buried him in the rain, the mud clinging to our boots like the grief clung to our souls. As the earth thudded onto his pine coffin, I realized that my mother's iron exterior wasn't born of coldness, but of a necessary armor. To survive without the help of the learned, one had to become as hard as the granite hills. I walked home that day and burned the dried rose he had once given me. I decided then that I would not be a victim of hope. I would learn everything my mother knew and more. I would become the person people called when the darkness closed in, even if I knew deep down that I was merely holding a candle against a hurricane. The years that followed the loss of Thomas were a blur of gray skies and green hills, as I threw myself into the only thing that gave me a sense of control over the chaotic cruelty of life. I became my mother's shadow. By 1855, at the age of 23, I was no longer just the daughter helping with the laundry. I was the one the neighbors whispered for in the middle of the night. I learned the language of the body that no book could teach, the specific heat of a fever that meant the blood was fighting, the pale look of a face that signaled the soul was preparing to depart, and the frantic, rhythmic gasping of a child whose throat was closing. I remember a night in the dead of January when a neighbor, a grizzled miner named Elias, came banging on our door. His wife, Martha, was in the throes of a difficult labor. It was her 7th child, but something was wrong. My mother was frail by then, her own joints stiffened by the damp Cornish winters. So she looked at me and nodded. "Go, Eliza," she said, her voice raspy. "Take the raspberry leaf and the clean linen, and take the lavender to calm her heart. You know what to do." I stepped out into a night so cold the air felt like needles in my lungs. As I walked to their small stone hut, I felt a weight on my shoulders that I hadn't asked for. In those days, a woman giving birth was walking through the valley of the shadow of death, without surgeons, without ether, without even the basic knowledge of cleanliness that you take for granted today. Every birth was a battlefield. I found Martha exhausted, her face the color of the ashes in her hearth. For 12 hours, I stayed with her. I used every trick my mother had taught me. I shifted her position. I massaged her abdomen with warmed oil, and I sang old songs to drown out her cries, so the other children in the next room wouldn't be terrified. When the babe finally arrived, it was blue and silent. I remember the absolute crushing silence of that room. Elias stood in the corner, his head bowed, already mourning, but I refused to let the silence win. I rubbed that tiny chest with a coarse cloth until the skin was raw, and I breathed my own breath into those minuscule lungs. When the first thin, reedy cry broke the air, I sat back on my heels and wept, not because I was happy, but because I was exhausted by the constant war we waged against the inevitable. Martha lived, and the boy lived, but I walked home in the dawn light feeling as though I had aged a decade in a single night. In the late 1850s, a new kind of talk began to drift into our village. Travelers spoke of hospitals in the big cities like London and Plymouth, places where men studied the body as if it were a machine. They spoke of doctors who had tools made of shining steel. To us, it sounded like fairy tales. How could a man in a white coat know more than the earth that had sustained us for generations? We were skeptical and perhaps a little defensive. Our way of life was hard, but it was ours. We didn't realize then that the world was shifting beneath our feet, and that the old ways, the ways of the root and the prayer, were being measured and found wanting. I eventually married a man named William, a carpenter who was kind and steady, a man who didn't mind the smell of vinegar and herbs that followed me everywhere. We built a life on the edge of the village, and for a few years I dared to believe that I had finally found a rhythm that wouldn't be broken by tragedy. I had 2 daughters, Sarah and Jane, and I watched them grow with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. I checked their throats every morning. I made them wear pouches of camphor around their necks. I was a mother, but I was also a soldier on guard duty. But the 1860s brought a change that no herb could combat. The mines began to fail, and with the poverty came a deeper, more stubborn kind of sickness. People were tired, their spirits worn thin by hunger, and when the Great Fever arrived in 1864, it tore through our community like a scythe through wheat. It wasn't like the previous illnesses. It was fast, and it was merciless. I spent weeks moving from house to house, my own children left in the care of my aging mother. I saw things that I still cannot speak of. Families where the parents died in the morning and the children followed by sunset. I remember standing in the middle of the village road, looking at the shuttered windows and the death carts, and feeling a sudden, blinding anger. I looked at my hands, stained with the juices of the plants I had gathered, and I realized they were not enough. We were fighting an army with nothing but pebbles. I began to hear more about the new medicine, about something called disinfectants and vaccinations. Part of me wanted to scream at the sky. Where were these things when Thomas was gasping for air? Where were they when my sister Mary's leg turned black? We were the generation left behind, the ones who had to hold the line with nothing but grit and superstition while the rest of the world moved toward the light. I didn't know then that my greatest test was still to come, and that the silence of the moors was about to be broken by a grief I couldn't heal. The year 1871 is etched into my soul like a scar that refused to heal. By then my daughters, Sarah and Jane, were no longer the little girls clutching my skirts. They were blossoming into young women, full of the same vibrant energy that Thomas once had. We were living in a small cottage near the edge of the cliffs, and my husband William had spent the summer carving furniture for our parlor. It was a season of rare peace, the kind that makes you forget for a moment that the world is a predatory thing. But the peace was a lie. It started with a simple afternoon of laundry. The girls had gone down to the valley to gather water and spread the linens to bleach in the sun. When they returned, Jane complained of a slight headache and a stiffness in her neck. I felt her brow, and it was cool. I told myself it was just the heat of the July sun. I gave her a tea of lemon balm and told her to rest. But by nightfall, the cooling breeze of the Atlantic brought no relief. Jane began to vomit, and her fever spiked so high that her skin felt as though it were baking from the inside. I used every bit of knowledge I had gathered over 40 years. I applied cold compresses of vinegar and water to her head. I tried to spoon of willow bark broth into her mouth, but she could not swallow. Then the most terrifying symptom of all appeared. She could no longer tuck her chin to her chest. Her back began to arch involuntarily, and her screams were not of pain, but of a primal neurological terror. I realized then that this was not a fever I had ever seen before. It was the brain fever, the black death of the nerves that we now know as meningitis. In that moment, the isolation of our lives felt like a physical weight crushing the air from my lungs. I looked out the window at the dark, empty moors and realized there was no one to call. The nearest man who called himself a doctor was 10 miles away in a larger town. And even if William rode the horse until it collapsed, that man had no carriage and no medicine that could outrun this fire. I was the wise woman of the village, the one everyone came to for help, and I was standing over my own daughter with hands that felt utterly useless. I remember the third night most vividly. The candle was flickering in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Jane was no longer screaming. She had fallen into a deep, unresponsive stupor. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. I sat by her bed, clutching a bundle of dried herbs that I knew in my heart were nothing more than dead weeds against this monster. I felt a sudden, violent surge of resentment toward the world. I thought of the stories of the new scientific hospitals and the men with their microscopes. I felt like a primitive creature huddling in a cave while the stars burned out above me. "Please," I whispered into the dark, not knowing if I was talking to God or the earth or the wind. "Just give me a sign. Tell me what to do." But the only answer was the rhythmic, labored gasping from the bed. William sat in the corner, his head in his hands, his strong carpenter's fingers trembling. We were two people who had spent our lives building and healing, and we were being forced to watch our creation crumble. Jane died at 4 in the morning, just as the first gray light touched the tops of the cliffs. She was 19 years old. The aftermath was a hollow silence that seemed to coat everything in dust. But the tragedy was not finished. 2 days after we laid Jane in the earth, Sarah began to stumble. She didn't have the fever, but her legs simply gave out. I watched in horror as my remaining daughter, my last link to the future, lost the ability to walk. This was the infantile paralysis that was beginning to haunt the country. Again, there were no braces, no therapies, no specialists. There was only me, massaging her lifeless legs with peppermint oil and weeping in the woods so she wouldn't hear me. I had spent my life believing that nature was a pharmacy, a provider of remedies, if only one were diligent enough to find them. But as I sat by Sarah's chair, Watching her look out at the hills she would never climb again, I realized that nature was also a butcher. We lived in a world of raw, unfiltered biological war, and we were losing. My faith in the old ways didn't just break, it shattered. I looked at my shelves of jars and bottles, the elderberry, the valerian, the coltsfoot, and I saw them for what they truly were, a desperate attempt to feel powerful in a world where we were entirely helpless. I didn't want to be a wise woman anymore. I wanted to be a woman who lived in a world where children didn't just vanish into the dirt because of a sip of bad water or a microscopic invader we couldn't even see. The world I inhabit now, in this year of 1926, is a place of miracles that would have seemed like sorcery to the girl I once was. I sit in my chair and hear the hum of the electric wires, and I know that just down the road there is a man with a telephone who can summon help in a matter of minutes. I see the young mothers in the village taking their infants to be weighed and poked by white-gloved nurses, and I see the lack of fear in their eyes. They do not look at their children and wonder which ones will survive the winter. They expect them all to live. It is a beautiful, staggering expectation. My husband, William, passed away in the autumn of 1898. He did not die of a sudden plague or a dramatic accident. He died of a tired heart, worn out by years of labor and the quiet weight of the grief we shared. In his final days, a young doctor actually came to our house. He was a lad from the city with a leather bag and a stethoscope. I remember watching him with a mixture of awe and a bitter, lingering resentment. He spoke of circulation and valves, and he gave William a small brown bottle of digitalis. It didn't save him, but it gave him a peaceful end, free from the gasping terror that had claimed Thomas and Jane. As I sat by William's bed, I realized that the era of the wise woman was finally over. The mystery of the body was being mapped out, and the darkness was being pushed back. Inch by inch, my daughter Sarah lived until 1912. She never walked again, but she became the finest seamstress in the county. She lived her life in a wheeled chair that William built for her, her spirit remaining as sharp as the needles she used. We never spoke much about the night Jane died. Some things are too heavy to be moved by words. But in her final years, Sarah and I would sit in the garden of roses I finally planted in memory of a boy's promise, and we would watch the motor cars begin to rattle down the lane. She would laugh at the noise of them, but I would look at those machines and see the end of the isolation that had killed my sister, my first love, and my eldest daughter. I am the last of my line now. My siblings are all gone, buried in the same soil that took our youth and our strength. People often ask me if I miss the good old days, the simplicity of the mid-19th century. I look at them with my clouded eyes, and I want to shake them. There was nothing good about the silence of a house where a child is dying of a thirst you cannot quench. There was nothing simple about the choice between an infected limb and a butcher's saw. We were not living in a pastoral poem. We were survivors of a long, brutal war against an invisible enemy. I kept my mother's old herb chest for a long time. It sat in the corner of my kitchen like a tombstone. A few years ago, I finally emptied it. I took the dried bundles of yarrow and the jars of foxglove, and I threw them into the fire. I watched the smoke rise up the chimney and felt a strange sense of liberation. Those plants were our friends when we had no others, but they were also a reminder of our helplessness. I would trade every secret root and every ancient remedy I ever knew for a single dose of the medicines they have now. As I prepare to close my eyes for the final time, I find I am not afraid. I have lived through the greatest transformation in human history. I have seen the world move from the candle to the light bulb, from the horse to the airplane, and from the herbalist to the surgeon. My only regret is that the change came too late for the ones I loved. I like to imagine that somewhere in a place beyond the moors and the cliffs, Jane is breathing deeply and Thomas is building a roof that never leaks. I hope the people of the future remember us, not as figures in a faded photograph, but as real people who felt the sun on our faces and the ache of loss in our hearts. We paved the way for this new world with our bodies and our tears. We lived without doctors so that you wouldn't have to. And as the fire in my hearth burns low, I am content. The world is louder now and faster, and perhaps a bit more clinical, but it is also kinder to the living. And that is all I ever prayed for in the long, dark nights of 1832.